Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGOs Soul and Strategy, and I'm quite excited to talk about today's topic. It's one of my favorite topics, even though I don't know a lot about that, but that's why I invited May Miller-Dawkins to talk to us today on the show about the relationship between social movements and officially registered NGOs. What happens in that dynamic? What happens in that interaction? What can be very positive and complementary, and where can that relationship become unproductive or even harmful? That's the focus of today's session. So welcome, May.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
I'm really pleased to do this. So let me tell you first, listeners, a little bit about May. She is I think, not just by profession, but also by identity, both a researcher, an advocate, and a facilitator. And May works both with social movements, NGOs, also with foundations, with community organizations, and sometimes with the universities, and the kind of translation between those actors as they try to work together. May used to be based in Australia, was in the US for a while, and is now in New Zealand. She works, as I said, with social movements and other social sector organizations, particularly to strengthen their advocacy, deepen their coalitions, and sharpen their analysis. And I heard in our preparatory discussion, you do quite a bit of facilitation of reflective work. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, both within organizations, but also between leaders across different systems and sectors and movements.
It's really neat work what you do. May is also the former director of a really interesting organization that another time I would love to interview May about, and that is the kind of sector of corporate activism. She worked, in this case, she headed the governance and transparency team at the B team, which is an organization that seeks to redefine the culture of accountability in business by creating and encouraging the diffusion of new norms for business in society, which I just think is a fascinating topic, but for another time. She was the head of research at Core Lab, where she focused on research aimed at influencing policy and practice. And she is also, earlier on in her career, was the head of research at Oxfam, Australia. So there we go, May. Here is my first question. Let's dive a little abruptly into social movements and how we should evaluate their effectiveness. So we know that social movements can exert different forms of influence and power. And I find the framework for evaluating social movements that Innovation Network here in the US uses, that they have developed, very helpful. But I'm not a social movement expert, you are. So I'm going to ask you, so Innovation Network distinguishes 4 dimensions for evaluating social movements. 1 is institutional power, so the power to influence the who, how, and what of visible decision makers. 2 is the dimension of people power, so the power to build, mobilize, and sustain large-scale public support. 3 is the dimension of influencer power, so that is the power to develop, maintain, and leverage relationships with people and institutions that have an influence over and access to resources, whether it's social resources, cultural resources, or financial resources. And then 4th, interestingly enough, I think, they identify the dimension of narrative power that social movements can have. So the power to, what Innovation Network calls, the power to transform and hold public narratives and ideologies and limit the influence of opposing narratives. Now, I threw a whole lot at you, but to the extent you were able to make some notes and start thinking about this, do these 4 dimensions, do they make sense to you? If so, can you offer some examples of some or each of these dimensions to make this topic of what is unique about social movements and their potential power, to make it more concrete for our listeners?
I think it's a very useful framework. I mean, part of what I think is distinctive and useful in thinking about social movements is often some other elements that maybe underpin these kinds of power. So often there's a kind of credibility grounded in people who are most affected, often initiating and engaging in that struggle, either for a shift in power, a change in circumstances, or indeed, as you say, preventing negative change. You think about Indigenous movements blockading mines, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that often then, part of what we have to look at when we're thinking about and evaluating social movements, as opposed to the ways that we often evaluate more formal organizations, is about the time frame. So often these shifts and this influence is building over a longer time frame, and even things like, if you even think about the narrative power, if you think back to the kinds of ways that people evaluated, say, Occupy Wall Street soon after it happened, there's not enough concrete policy demands, they haven't had enough kind of direct influence. But then you also look since then, over the past 12 more 13 years, at the shifts in what has become politically not only possible but kind of expected, say, of the Democrats, and you can kind of see the longer term arc of some of those shifts
of influence.
And I think of the influence, and I think there's a similar ability to look at kind of modern movement-driven civil rights movements like Black Lives Matter, and how that fed into and enabled a lot of the racial justice reckoning that's happening now, as well as, say, the LGBT movement over time, and the way in which they built both the kind of people and public power, the cultural influence, as well as that institutional and influence over policy. But that was quite a crucial mix to kind of support the level of change in both norms and law to go together. And I think that's a lot of what social movements can enable at their best, is kind of a deep shift that can be sustained, rather than potentially a kind of short-term, say, policy wins that are much easier to reverse.
Interesting.
Which can often happen in kind of more traditional forms of advocacy.
Yeah, interesting. So a deeper shift that can be sustained is something that social movements, by nature of their strengths, are potentially enabled or able to achieve in a way that, for instance, NGOs probably cannot hope for, at least unless they work in coalitions with a lot of other actors, and including some social movements.
That's right. And NGOs, social movements are often made up of a lot of NGOs in different ways, right? There's a lot of kind of blurring between the categories. But I think this level of kind of profound influence on how we understand an issue and conceive of something, I think it's also been backed up in really very rigorous kind of research. So I think about things like Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's research on the success of nonviolent resistance in democratic change over the past century. But I also think about Weldon and Hatun's research about the factors that have led to changes in women's rights policies across a lot of countries, and that the single factor that was most determinative was actually the existence of kind of strong independent feminist movements, and that was more important than left-wing parties in power, than having women in politics, than levels of national wealth. And part of that was that actually, where there were independent feminist movements, they didn't spend all their time arguing from the margins of their own organisations about the validity of the agenda. And so they they over time were able to sustain real shifts in policy around things like domestic violence. And so I think those are quite, you know, important pieces of evidence that have looked across countries and across time about what enables quite sustained, you know, and significant change. And I think social movements have an enormous role to play in that.
Let me just make a pitch, May, that if you're able after our session today to send me 1 or 2 short kind of practitioner oriented summaries of the work that you just mentioned, then our listeners, some of whom will not be familiar with the authors that you just mentioned, it would be helpful to have that in the show notes. I just want to delve a little bit deeper. And when there was a time when I read a little bit of the more academic and pre-academic literature on social movements. It's been a while, but what I recall there is the role of shared grievances and personally experienced injustice that makes social movements stand out from, in this case, juxtaposing them with NGOs. That doesn't mean that NGOs cannot have staff and volunteers and leaders who have also shared grievance, direct lived experience, but it tends to differentiate it too. Talk to me a little bit about what the impact of that is when it comes to social movements.
I think it's quite crucial for the character and also the aims and the strategies of social movements that's true, because it tends to mean that the accountability for the social movement is more oriented to its members, to its composed parts, and there's a much stronger sense of what those grievances or what that desired change is. And there's kind of less, I guess there's, you know, if we think about, say, Bill Moyer's activist roles, which a lot of people in social movements obviously kind of think about and look to, then, you know, on the more activist and kind of rebellious end, you're staying much closer to those aims and kind of less compromising. And less incremental. So you're less oriented to what is politically possible right now, and more oriented to, I guess, a belief that it's possible to really significantly shift the conditions under which we're living. And I think part of the dynamic that a lot of movements face is, of course, that there's a lot of pressure to formalize and to start to look more like NGOs and organizations. And that comes from multiple quarters. You know, it comes both from, you know, the value sometimes of structure around how we organize ourselves, that it can be hard to hold together a loose and informal movement over time. It comes from the fact that it's that the funding system has been, even though there are more funders now who are actively trying to fund movements, they just in practice require a level of structure that looks like an NGO often to even transfer, you know, the funds. And they start to then, you know, and so as movements potentially professionalize in that way, they can then be pulled more towards accountability to donors and towards slightly more palatable positions at times. And so there's a real tension over time, I think, for movements.
Super interesting
how they navigate that.
I do want to probe you a little bit more before we go on to the next question about accountability to members. So I know that social movements have the aura, and I'm saying it for purpose a little provocatively, of being more democratic than NGOs. My question, though, is that really the case? So is that true in most social movements that you've been able to either work with, engage with, or study? Is that really true? Or are there just as much social movements where you have charismatic, but fairly actually autocratic leaders? Some of them quite difficult, for instance, for women to have formal or informal leadership roles in, etc. Are we ever at risk of romanticizing this?
Yeah, well, I think it's important not to. And actually, so I was involved in some research with the Fight Inequality Alliance, which is the kind of alliance of inequality movements around the world, and RISE, which works with a lot of social movements, and the LSE, Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity, a couple of years ago, about the kind of emerging inequality movements. And we did a lot of interviewing and surveying of movements in different countries. And what we found was absolutely that movements had a real mix of some that had very kind of consciously put in place either democratic forms of governance that were also to protect that orientation to community and to those who are involved, or kind of shared leadership structures as well that are actually very difficult to maintain, that take a lot of conscious work and effort
and transaction time.
Exactly. And but a lot of movements, I guess, are in a sense can be committed to that work of trying to align how they work with how they want things to be in the world. But others, where we heard a lot about those structures being put in place, but still actually the real informal truth of it was that certain people held a lot of power and others didn't. We looked very explicitly actually at the kind of feminist commitment of movements, and we found a very mixed bag. So some proportion of movements that had a very explicit feminist commitment, which was both about how they operated, how they saw things in the world, what they saw their role as, but a good proportion that didn't have that commitment. And in the middle, a lot who felt that what really mattered was the common social and economic inequities, and that it was open to participation and weren't committed to any additional effort. And of course, we know there are lots of movements that have issues of huge, of racism, of exclusion, of gender inequity, of harassment and exploitation. And so it's important not to romanticize, because in any of these efforts, there needs to be enormous consciousness about not reproducing the power dynamics of the societies that we're operating in, because that naturally creeps in.
Yes, because that
very
comes
frequently
with human beings. Yes. And by the way, since you mentioned shared leadership and feminist critiques as well as feminist-led organizations, I just want to just mention to our listeners that in a recent set of podcast interviews, I've interviewed some of the big thinkers on feminist leadership, like Srilata Batliwala and Aruna Rao, and Lisa Vinneklassen, etc. So if you're interested to learn more about that, I'd like to refer you to those episodes. So following on that, May, so social movements are frequently praised for their quote unquote organic, authentic nature. And they're seen as an expression of, and I'm doing an air quote here for audio listeners, as an expression of true citizen agency. And that praise is often offset against criticism on nonprofits and NGOs as kind of examples of stultified, upwardly accountable organizations. You mentioned that already, right? That are primarily, as I sometimes call it, the expression of intent to do good by a small set of frequently white, educated people of middle class or upper middle class, or people with money. And the assertion being that NGOs and nonprofits primarily maintain the status quo, but social movements have the capability to really affect those structural causes. So when do you think this praise for social movement, respectively this criticism on nonprofits, is justified, and when is it not?
So I think that it depends a lot, obviously, as we've been discussing, on how movements and NGOs operate. So where they see themselves as deriving their legitimacy from, and how they're organized to respond to that, and what they see as their role in the system. I think and again, in the kind of classics, say, Bill Moyer's model of how change happens and the kind of activist roles, it's true that, different kinds of actors and organizations often do play different roles at different stages in the process. So, if you're thinking about actually really raising an issue into public and political consciousness, that's often done, more effectively by social movements and, say, by professionalized, smaller, more expert policy NGOs, although they often are very good at setting agendas within institutions or maybe more elite circles. But kind of, as you maybe past the point where you've actually over time have really seen significant narrative and public shifts, and also influenced significant players in different parts of society, reformers and some of the NGOs come more into their own because they're much more tied into some of the detailed work of making policy and translating some of that change into the detail. But of course, people can play across all of those different ends. I mean, you think about the detail of the Green New Deal that's being developed, through social movements and is kind of setting policy agendas now. So, I mean, I think a lot of what is very hard to do on both sides is to step back and see that complementarity, because I think you can get very embedded in your own view about how change happens and what's legitimate and what needs to happen when. And I would definitely say, the NGOs are often more at risk of reinforcing their own power, kind of existing structures. And so there's a need for really critical ongoing reflection, I think, in those NGOs that have been established separate from the groups who have the grievances, who are most affected by the issues. There's a much greater responsibility on those groups to be very critically reflective about their role, and especially when their insider incrementalism might be being co-opted by decision makers. So, I think a lot even about, an anecdote from my time when I was with Oxfam and during the World Trade Organization negotiations in Hong Kong in 2005. And I was working at the time on a program that worked with young activists in about 90 countries. And we've been working with a group who were working on agricultural access to medicines issues across different countries. We'd brought a bunch of them to the ministerial because they were engaging with their own governments. But I was also involved in the general kind of Oxfam coordination around the ministerial. Right. And the dynamic that I think just needed to be even more explicitly kind of acknowledged as Oxfam made its daily strategic decisions was that Oxfam was very much in the room because there were Korean farmers and Cambodian sex workers and a whole movement that were out on the streets outside. And that happens very frequently, right? NGOs have a certain amount of credibility that in essence comes from the fact that they're a much more palatable interlocutor for decision makers and power holders rather than engaging, say, with the people on the streets.
Yeah.
And so how does an NGO navigate its understanding that maybe its credibility and access comes from that, not just from its expertise? And so what kind of relationships do you owe those movements if your access
is so derived
from their action? And I think that's one dynamic that, it's very hard to walk for a lot of NGOs, in part because they are somewhat bought into their own value, to their own expertise, to their own to their own analysis and strategic, people's own professional kind of identity is caught up in their strategic nous and ability to navigate the power and political dynamics around it. So so I think that that's one area where I feel it plays out very, very strongly.
Oh, nice. Oh, there's so many things that we could talk deeper about, and yet we don't have the time. I do want to say, so is there more that you can tell us about that relationship between social movement and NGOs? Where can you give examples of positive and complementarity where that was well expressed and on both sides respected and upheld? And where have you seen harmful or unproductive attempts at collaborations?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll start with the harmful, and less examples, but I guess more. So from some research that I did with RISE and the Atlantic Council back in 2016 and 2017, and we worked with researchers in 10 countries and engaged with over 1,000 activists about their relationships with outside, so foreign NGOs, foundations, kind of others. And part of what we found, which was pretty amazing in terms of the extent of potential harm, was that activists were as likely to have had a negative as a positive experience of collaboration.
I see.
And a lot of that came down to a lack of respect for local organizations and activists' autonomy and views and perspective. And at its worst, what that led to in terms of harm were really significant safety and security, risks. This is in a lot of countries that have really significant repression. So I think the extent of harm is really significant, and in the work that I do now with a Aboriginal community controlled organisation in Australia, who are really working for some really deep long-term community-led change in their own community, but also very systemically minded. They so frequently are approached or engaged in ways that are really quite transactional for other organizations, who want access to that community or access to, or their support. And I think what movements and community-based led organizations really want, and the conditions for really good collaboration, I mean, it sounds obvious, but it really does come down to respect and to an ability to navigate and shift power and share power within that relationship. And I think we all know that the systems that NGOs are operating in terms of their own funding, what they have to demonstrate as their contribution, all of that often plays against it. And in our research,
if I may, even not just the accountabilities towards funding and funding source, but also accountabilities towards upper accountability within the organization, towards the board, right? And even at the most basic level, what shall I call it? The imperative of institutional survival is very strong in any formal organization, whether it's nonprofit or private sector or government. And so that can get in the way as well, in a way that maybe is not the same for social movements. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think it's always the same. I mean, as we know, the categories kind of can blur together. So it depends how formalized the movement is, but I do think that's stronger. The need to be able to tell a story about your relevance and impact is very strong on the organizational side. And I think also the research that we did on inequality movements, part of the story that we heard is that often there were national level, capital level NGOs who were professed a very strong commitment to community-led change. And I don't think any of that is kind of insincere, right, on its face. But in a sense, they are so tied in as well to those political timeframes and dynamics. And there's a different sense of urgency, and so that there's and also a kind of set of implicit beliefs and biases about expertise, about capability, about what they know. And so often there would be a tendency to kind of micromanage local campaigns or work, and to push the timing of things to not allow for kind of adequate time for community organizing. And so then that also puts a lot of local groups and movements in some peril, because they're being kind of pushed to undermine their own processes to contribute maybe to this national change. And I guess where I think, you know, it's most transformative is where NGOs or institutions that can recognize that they have more power already make a conscious decision to cede power or to take the lead of movements or local groups. And I think we can't underestimate how hard that is for institutions, but also for the individuals involved. And I think a lot of social movements become very wary about those collaborations because they have experiences of lack of respect, or there's a sense of kind of being co-opted maybe for the credibility of the movement, but not really listened to, you know, not really able to make the decisions that matter about what we should be asking for and when and on what time frame. So it's a hard one to navigate. I think often when you look back at big changes that have happened, you can see very clearly the complementary roles that different groups have played. But I think in the moment, that's a very hard thing to hold and to navigate.
We're almost at the end of our interview, but I cannot help asking, when do you see social movement interlocutors make mistakes in their negotiation with NGOs that you think are avoidable mistakes, that so at a tactical level, if you will, that you would advise them to not do?
I think it's very important for movements to be clear about what's non-negotiable for them.
Okay.
Which might be about process, might be about decision-making and autonomy. But I think naturally that often happens when funding negotiations are involved. You know, you're in the kind of funding system, because a lot of funders aren't set up to give money directly to movements or movement-like or more informal groups, or kind of have a distrust of giving money directly to community controlled groups as well, which is a huge issue. And so, as we know, so much of the funding system, even though it's changing, has been mediated through the larger NGOs, and they then operate as their own kind of mini funders and gatekeepers. And so there's, you know, they not only have often institutional power and, you know, as we were saying before, kind of privileges, often say white or capital dominated or whatever that looks like, but then they also obviously have the power of the purse strings. And so I think, you know, movements need to think very carefully about what they're willing to agree to when they do accept, say, money through NGOs. And NGOs need to think very consciously about how might this look different if we're supporting an NGO in terms of the kind of long-term, flexible, unconditional funds where the movement has real autonomy and control over its agenda and its strategies and actions. Because I think we know in practice, but also, you know, from the research and the evidence base that we have, that's when movements have the best chance of actually bringing about really significant change. And so the funding needs to look different to something that's output driven and etc. Although I think there are some funny examples about that. I know Duncan Green's written about, you know, some examples of you know, supporting Bolivian indigenous movements by structuring the funding as a series of workshops, which was really actually funding a kind of long march, but they so they
had to do it in that.
Exactly. And I think if people are adeptly working within the system, but to support movements in a way that actually makes sense for the movement, that's totally fine. What's really damaging is forcing movements into changing how they operate in order to be able to access support, solidarity, resources, that they desperately need and are being held by others.
Yeah, fascinating. We could talk so much longer, but I'm going to ask you now a very impromptu question, and I'd love you to give a kind of a quick, spontaneous answer to bring this to a close. And so I'm going to mention half of a sentence, and I'm asking you to finish it. The world can never have enough of ...
Brave, reflective, collective leadership.
Aha, nice. Brave, collective, and reflective leadership. Entirely aligned with the rest of our conversation. Very smart. Sometimes, interviewees pivot in a very different direction or mention something from their personal life, and you kept it within what we talked about. Brilliant. Well, May, where should people go if they want to learn more about your super interesting work?
Sure. Well, they can look at my out-of-date website. It's www.maymiller-dawkins.com. And I'm on the social platforms, but extremely inactive. So they can do that. And the one other plug I'd give is for a network of women involved in kind of global activism and global justice that an old troublemaking friend, Chloe Safir, and I started some years ago, but has moved into a much more globalized leadership called Internationalistas. And people can also look for that and join that community of kind of 4,000 to 5,000 troublemaking women on Facebook. And I can send through the link to that as well.
That would be good, because that last one I'm not familiar with. Who knows that I would be interested in that as well. So that is maymiller-dawkins.com, your LinkedIn profile, of course, and the third site that you're going to send me. We'll put that in the show notes. Well, thank you, May, for all your insights, and thank you, listeners. I found it really fascinating. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then please check out some of the other episodes in my podcasts. You can find them through my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org, but also on my new YouTube channel, where we offer the videos of some of these podcasts. Subscribe and you're always the first to be in the know. And if you found this podcast valuable, then please help other leaders find it too by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. On my website, you can also find more information about our co-authored book, Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs. So May, thank you once again. And listeners, this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGOs, Soul and Strategy next time.